the frozen Duchess who thawed his soul. They said the Duchess had no heart. They were wrong. She'd merely buried it, until his warmth unearthed the pain she swore she'd never feel again in a world where hearts turned to ice to survive. Hers was the coldest, until he dared to melt it. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know where you're watching from on comments section. I pray may the good God Almighty bless and preserve you all and your family. Amen. Let's begin. The winter of 1847 carved its way through the English countryside with the precision of a surgeon's blade, cold and unforgiving. Snow fell upon Ashworth Manor in thick, relentless sheets, blanketing the estate's sprawling grounds until the ancient oaks stood like skeletal sentinels draped in white shrouds. Inside the manor's great hall, where portraits of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls in gilded frames, a different kind of cold had settled, one that no hearth fire could ever touch. Lady Catherine Ashworth stood at the frost-kissed window of her private chambers, her reflection ghostly in the glass. At 26, she possessed the kind of beauty that Renaissance painters had once killed to capture. High cheekbones that could cut glass, eyes the color of winter storm clouds, and hair so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But there was something about her beauty that unsettled people, something that made servants avert their eyes and suitors stumble over their rehearsed compliments. It was the coldness in her gaze, the way her lips never quite curved into a genuine smile, the mechanical precision with which she moved through the world as if she were merely a clockwork replica of a woman rather than flesh and blood. She had not always been this way. Once, a lifetime ago, or so it seemed, she had been Catherine Fairfax, youngest daughter of a country vicar, with wildflowers in her hair and laughter that rang like church bells across summer meadows. She had believed in fairy tales then, in true love and happy endings, in the goodness of people and the mercy of God. She had believed in Edward. Edward Whitmore had been everything a young woman could dream of: handsome, charming, with a smile that made promises his heart had no intention of keeping. He had courted her with poetry and moonlit walks, had spoken of a future filled with children and joy and growing old together beneath the same roof. Catherine had given him everything: her heart, her trust, her innocence. And on what should have been their wedding day, as she stood in her mother's carefully preserved wedding dress, clutching a bouquet of white roses that her father had grown specifically for the occasion, Edward had simply never arrived. The note had come instead, delivered by a shamefaced servant who could barely meet her eyes. 10 words that had shattered her world like a hammer through stained glass. "I cannot marry you. I have chosen another. Forgive me." The scandal had been devastating. In their small village, such things were not easily forgotten or forgiven. The whispers had followed Catherine everywhere, to church, to the market, even into her own home. "What did she do to drive him away?" they murmured. There must have been something wrong with her. Her younger sister's marriage prospects had evaporated overnight. Her father, already frail, had suffered an apoplexy and died within the month. Her mother had followed him to the grave before the year was out, some said from a broken heart, though the doctor had called it consumption. But Catherine had survived. She had done more than survive, she had transformed. When her distant cousin, the elderly Duke of Ashworth, had offered her a position as companion to his invalid wife, she had accepted without hesitation. She had left behind Catherine Fairfax, the naive country girl who believed in love, and had become something harder, colder, more resilient. When the Duchess had died 2 years later and the old Duke, in a surprising turn, had proposed marriage to Catherine, seeking an heir and finding in her a woman who would neither demand his affection nor mourn his eventual passing, she had accepted that too, with the same emotional detachment with which one might accept an invitation to tea. The Duke had been 73, she 22. He had been kind enough, in his distant way, and had asked nothing of her except her presence at formal occasions and her willingness to endure the marriage bed often enough to produce an heir. She had given him a son within the year, a sickly child who had lived only 3 days, taking with him any warmth that might have remained in Catherine's heart. The Duke had died 6 months later, leaving her with his title, his fortune, and a heart so thoroughly frozen that she sometimes wondered if it still beat at all. Now, 3 years into her widowhood, Catherine ruled Ashworth Manor with efficiency and precision. She managed the estate's considerable holdings with an acumen that impressed even the most skeptical of her late husband's advisors. She donated generously to charity, attended the appropriate social functions, and maintained her position in society with careful calculation. She was respected, even admired by some, but she was not loved. And that, she told herself during the long, sleepless nights when the ghosts of her past came calling, was exactly as it should be. Love was a fairy tale for fools, a poison disguised as medicine, a trap that she would never fall into again. The knock at her chamber door came precisely at 7 o'clock, as it did every morning. "Enter," Catherine said, her voice carrying the clipped authority that she had perfected over the years. Mrs. Talbot, the head housekeeper, bustled in with Catherine's morning correspondence on a silver tray. She was a stout woman in her 50s with kind eyes that had seen too much of life to be easily shocked, and she was one of the few people in the manor who seemed genuinely unafraid of the Duchess.
"Good morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Talbot said, setting the tray on the writing desk near the window. "There's quite a bit of post this morning. Several invitations, some business from your solicitor and—" She paused, her expression shifting to something between concern and curiosity. "A letter from London, from the War Office." Catherine's hand stilled on the windowsill. The War Office. That could mean only one thing. Something to do with the war in the Crimea, where Britain had been entangled for nearly 3 years in a bloody conflict that seemed to have no end in sight. But what could the War Office possibly want with her? "Thank you, Mrs. Talbot. That will be all." The housekeeper bobbed a curtsy and departed, though not without casting one last curious glance over her shoulder. Catherine waited until the door clicked shut before moving to the desk. She sorted through the correspondence with practiced efficiency. An invitation to Lady Pemberton's ball, which she would decline. A letter from her solicitor regarding some property investments, which she would review later. A note from the vicar requesting her presence at the church's Christmas charity drive, which she would attend out of obligation rather than any genuine charitable impulse. And then the letter from the War Office. The seal was official, the paper heavy and expensive. Catherine broke the wax and unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the formal language with growing disbelief. "Your Grace, Duchess of Ashworth, it is with great respect that we write to you on a matter of considerable delicacy and national importance. As you may be aware, the conflict in the Crimea has produced a great number of casualties, and our hospitals are overwhelmed with wounded soldiers in need of care and recuperation. We have been conducting a survey of country estates that might be suitable for conversion into convalescent hospitals for officers recovering from their injuries. Ashworth Manor, given its size, location, and facilities, has been identified as an ideal candidate for such a purpose. We understand that this is an unusual request, and we would not make it if the need were not dire. We would, of course, provide all necessary medical staff and supplies, and would compensate you generously for the use of your home. The officers in question would be men of good family and character, recovering from honorable wounds sustained in the service of Queen and country. We await your response with great hope and appreciation. Your obedient servant, Colonel Sir James Whitfield, Director, Medical Services, War Office. Catherine read the letter twice, then a third time, her mind working through the implications with the same cold calculation she applied to all her decisions. To convert Ashworth Manor into a hospital for wounded soldiers. It was audacious, unprecedented, and deeply inconvenient. The manor was her sanctuary, her carefully controlled domain where every element existed in perfect order. To fill it with wounded men, with their pain and their needs and their inevitable emotional demands, would shatter the ice-smooth surface of her existence. And yet, she looked around her chambers, at the expensive furniture and priceless artwork, at the luxury that surrounded her like a gilded cage. What was she doing with all of this? What purpose did her life serve beyond managing accounts and attending tedious social functions and maintaining a facade of propriety? She had money, title, position, and she had nothing at all. She was 26 years old and already dead inside, going through the motions of living without ever truly being alive. Perhaps that was why, when she sat down at her writing desk and drew out a sheet of her personal stationery, she found herself writing words that surprised even her. Colonel Sir James Whitfield, I am in receipt of your letter dated December 3, 1847. After careful consideration, I am willing to offer Ashworth Manor for use as a convalescent hospital for wounded officers, under the following conditions. First, that the conversion of the manor be conducted with respect for the property and its contents. Second, that I retain my private chambers and a small staff for my personal needs. Third, that I be given a role in the administration and management of the hospital, as I believe my knowledge of the estate and its resources would prove valuable. That I await further instructions on how we should proceed. Sincerely, Catherine, Duchess of Ashworth. She sealed the letter before she could reconsider, before the voice of caution in her head could talk her out of this moment of inexplicable impulse. She rang for a footman and instructed him to dispatch it immediately to London. It was done. For better or worse, she had just agreed to shatter the careful, frozen peace of her existence. She did not know then, could not have known, that with that single letter, she had set in motion events that would thaw the ice around her heart, and nearly destroy her in the process. 3 weeks later, on a bitter January morning when the wind howled like a wounded animal across the moors, the first group of wounded officers arrived at Ashworth Manor. Catherine stood in the entrance hall, flanked by Mrs. Talbot and the hastily assembled staff, watching as the carriages rolled up the long drive. In the weeks since she had sent her letter to the War Office, Ashworth Manor had been transformed. The grand ballroom had been converted into a ward with rows of hospital beds, each made up with crisp white linens. The morning room had become an examination area, equipped with medical supplies and instruments that Catherine found simultaneously fascinating and horrifying. Additional staff had been hired: nurses, orderlies, a surgeon, and various administrative personnel. Colonel Whitfield himself had arrived 2 days earlier to oversee the final preparations. He was a brisk, efficient man in his 50s with graying hair and eyes that had seen too much suffering to ever be entirely at peace. He had expressed his profound gratitude for Catherine's generosity, though she had seen the curiosity in his gaze, the unspoken question: why would a wealthy young duchess volunteer her home for such a purpose? She could not have answered him even if he had asked. She did not entirely understand it herself. Now, as the first carriage door opened and the wounded began to emerge, Catherine felt something she had not experienced in years: a flutter of nervousness in her chest, a crack in the ice. She watched as men in various stages of recovery climbed or were helped down from the carriages. Some walked with canes, others were missing limbs, still others bore no visible injuries but moved with the careful, haunted slowness of those whose wounds went deeper than flesh. Major Thornton, Colonel Whitfield announced, gesturing to a tall officer who had just descended from the lead carriage. He'll be taking charge of the officers during their stay. Major Thornton stepped forward, and Catherine's breath caught in her throat. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders that suggested strength despite the pronounced limp with which he moved. His face was striking rather than handsome, all hard angles and sharp lines, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of dark beard. His hair was black and slightly too long, curling at the collar of his uniform coat. But it was his eyes that arrested her, dark, almost black, and filled with a pain so profound that looking into them felt like staring into an abyss. There was a scar that ran from his left temple down to his jaw, still pink and healing, and another that disappeared into his collar. His left leg dragged slightly as he approached, and she noticed the way he leaned heavily on his cane with each step. But it was the way he held himself, with a rigid military bearing that suggested he was barely holding himself together through sheer force of will, that made her chest tighten with an emotion she could not name. "Your Grace," he said, bowing as deeply as his injuries would allow. His voice was deep and rough, as if it had been scraped raw by screaming or perhaps by silence. "I cannot adequately express our gratitude for your generosity. You have given these men hope at a time when hope was in desperately short supply." Catherine inclined her head, her face a perfect mask of polite disinterest even as something inside her shifted at the sight of him. "I am pleased to be of service to those who have sacrificed so much for our country, Major Thornton. I trust you will find Ashworth Manor suitable for your needs." "More than suitable, Your Grace. It is a palace compared to the field hospitals of the Crimea." Something flickered in his dark eyes. A memory, perhaps, or a ghost. "The men are fortunate beyond measure. Then let us not keep them standing in the cold any longer. Mrs. Talbot will show you to the wards. Colonel Whitfield has made all the necessary arrangements." She turned to leave, to retreat to her chambers and the safety of solitude, but Major Thornton's voice stopped her. "Your Grace, if I might have a word in private." Catherine paused, her hand on the banister of the grand staircase. Every instinct told her to refuse, to maintain the distance that was her armor against the world. But there was something in his voice, not pleading, but a quiet intensity, that made her turn back. "Of course, Major, we may speak in the library." She led him down the corridor to the library, acutely aware of his uneven gait behind her, the tap of his cane on the marble floors. The library was her favorite room in the manor, lined floor to ceiling with books, with leather chairs arranged before a massive fireplace where a fire always burned during the winter months. She gestured to one of the chairs and took a seat across from him, maintaining a careful distance. Up close, the Major's injuries were more apparent. The scar on his face was just one of many. She could see another peeking from his collar, and the way he moved suggested ribs that had been broken and perhaps never healed quite right. But it was his eyes that held her attention, those dark, haunted eyes that seemed to be looking at something far beyond her, something only he could see. "I wanted to speak with you before the others arrived in full force," he began, his hands resting on the head of his cane. "To give you some idea of what you might expect in the coming weeks and months. I have been briefed by Colonel Whitfield," Catherine replied, her voice cool and professional. "I understand the nature of their injuries and the anticipated length of their recovery." "Yes, but Colonel Whitfield has not lived in the field hospitals, has not seen what these men have endured." Major Thornton leaned forward slightly, his intensity palpable. "Some of these men have injuries that you can see. Missing limbs, scars, wounds that still seep despite the best efforts of the surgeons. But others carry wounds that cannot be seen, wounds of the mind and spirit. They wake screaming in the night from dreams of battles that will never end. They flinch at loud noises. They stare at nothing for hours, trapped in memories that refuse to release them." Catherine found herself leaning forward despite herself, drawn by the raw honesty in his words. "And you, Major Thornton? What manner of wounds do you carry?" The question escaped before she could stop it, far too personal for the formal distance she usually maintained. But instead of being offended, Major Thornton's lips quirked in something that might have been a smile if there had been any warmth in it. "All of the above, Your Grace. I am a walking catalogue of the cost of war." He paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. "I survived the charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava. 673 men rode into that valley. I am one of the 195 who rode out. The rest died or were captured, cut down by Russian guns in a charge that should never have been ordered, a catastrophic failure of command that cost the flower of British cavalry their lives." Catherine had read about the charge in the newspapers, about the terrible slaughter in the Valley of Death. But reading about it in the comfort of her morning room was nothing compared to sitting across from a man who had lived through it, who carried the weight of those deaths in his eyes. "I am sorry," she said, and was surprised to find that she meant it. "That must have been horrific." "Horrific does not begin to describe it, Your Grace. The sound of cannonballs tearing through horses and men, the screams, the smell of blood and gunpowder and death. These things do not leave you. They remain, constant companions, uninvited guests at every meal, every quiet moment, every attempt at sleep." He looked back at her, and for a moment, Their eyes met and held. "I tell you this not to burden you, but so that you understand what you have taken on. These men need more than medical care. They need patience, understanding, and perhaps most importantly, they need a reason to believe that life after war is worth living." "And do you believe that, Major?" The question was soft, almost a whisper. "That life after war is worth living?" For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at her with those dark, fathomless eyes. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "I do not know, Your Grace. I truly do not know. Most days, I wake and wonder why I survived when so many better men did not. I wonder what purpose my life serves beyond being a reminder of all that was lost. But these men—" He gestured vaguely toward the entrance hall, where the other officers were being settled into the wards. "They still have hope. Some of them still believe they can return to their lives, their families, their futures. And if I can help them find that hope again, then perhaps my survival will have served some purpose after all." Catherine found herself unable to look away from him. Here was a man who had experienced the worst that life could offer, who had been broken and shattered and put back together incorrectly, and yet who still thought first of helping others rather than himself. It was so unlike her own response to tragedy, her retreat into coldness and isolation, that it felt like a rebuke and a revelation all at once. "Then we shall work together to give them that hope, Major Thornton," she heard herself say. "I may not understand what they have endured, but I do understand suffering. And I understand the need to find purpose in a world that has proven itself to be cruel and capricious." Something shifted in his expression, a slight softening around his eyes that suggested surprise. "You speak as one who has known great loss yourself, Your Grace. We all have our battles, Major. Some are simply fought on different fields." She rose from her chair, suddenly needing to re-establish the distance between them, to retreat behind her walls before this man with his intensity and his pain could crack them any further. "Now, if you will excuse me, I should leave you to settle in. Mrs. Talbot and the staff will attend to any needs you or the other officers might have." She moved toward the door, but his voice stopped her once more. "Your Grace." She turned back, her hand on the doorknob. "Thank you, not just for opening your home, but for this conversation. For seeing us, truly seeing us, rather than just as broken soldiers to be pitted or hidden away." He paused, then added quietly, "It has been a long time since anyone looked at me and saw a man rather than a casualty of war." Catherine felt something crack inside her chest, a small fissure in the ice that she had so carefully constructed. She nodded, not trusting herself to speak, and fled from the library before he could see the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. The first tears she had allowed herself in years. She did not know then that Major Thornton, or rather Captain Alexander Thornton, for she would later learn that his promotion to major had come on the battlefield, a reward for surviving when so many had not, would become the key that unlocked all the doors she had bolted shut. She did not know that his darkness would call to hers, that his brokenness would somehow make her feel less alone in her own. She did not know that she was about to fall in love with him, and that this love would be nothing like the naive, innocent affection she had felt for Edward Whitmore. This love would be fire and ice, darkness and light, two damaged souls finding in each other not a fairy tale salvation, but something far more valuable, the courage to face their demons together. But that realization was still weeks away, hidden in the future like a secret waiting to be discovered. The days at Ashworth Manor fell into a rhythm, though it was a rhythm unlike anything Catherine had known in her years as Duchess. The manor that had once been silent except for the careful footsteps of servants and the ticking of countless clocks was now filled with life. The voices of the officers, the instructions of nurses, the occasional cry of pain when wounds were dressed or exercises attempted. Catherine found herself drawn into the daily operations of the hospital despite her initial intention to remain aloof and detached. She made rounds each morning with Major Thornton and Dr. Patterson, the surgeon who had been assigned to oversee medical care. She learned the names of each officer, their injuries, their prospects for recovery. She read to those who could not read themselves, wrote letters home for those whose hands shook too badly to hold a pen, and sat with those who needed simply to talk to someone who would listen without judgment. It was during these rounds that she truly came to understand what Major Thornton had meant about invisible wounds. There was Lieutenant Carstairs, barely 23, who had lost his right arm at the shoulder and spoke in a cheerful, almost manic way about returning to his regiment, even though everyone knew his military career was over. There was Captain Morrison, who had no visible injuries at all but who spent his days staring out the windows, silent and unreachable, trapped in memories of battles that refused to let him go. There was young Ensign Phillips, who wept uncontrollably at unexpected moments, his face still bearing the innocent softness of adolescence even as his eyes held the age of centuries. And then there was Major Thornton himself, who moved through the wards with quiet authority, a steadying presence for the younger officers and a fierce advocate when he felt the medical staff was not doing enough for his men. Catherine found herself watching him when she thought he wouldn't notice, fascinated by the contradictions he embodied. The gentleness with which he spoke to the wounded contrasted with the rigid control he maintained over himself. The way he could smile encouragingly at a struggling officer even as his own eyes remained haunted and distant. She noticed other things too. The way he favored his left leg more on cold days. How he sometimes pressed his hand to his ribs as if remembering old pain, the nightmares that woke him screaming. She had heard them from her chambers, those terrible cries in the dark hours before dawn. She noticed how he never spoke of his own suffering, how he deflected any question about his own recovery, how he drove himself to exhaustion in service of the other officers. It was on a particularly cold evening in late January, 3 weeks after the officer's arrival, that Catherine encountered Major Thornton in the library long after midnight. She had been unable to sleep, her mind restless with thoughts she could not quite name, and had come down to find a book. She had not expected to find him there, sitting in the chair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in his hand and a look of such profound despair on his face that she nearly turned away to give him privacy. But something made her step into the room instead. "Major Thornton, forgive me, I did not mean to intrude." He looked up, startled, and for a moment, she saw his face without its usual mask of control. Saw the exhaustion, the pain, the overwhelming weight of survival. Then the mask slipped back into place, though not quite as securely as before. "Your Grace, you are not intruding. This is your home, after all. I should apologize for taking liberties with your library and your whiskey." He gestured to the glass with a self-deprecating smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You are welcome to both." Catherine moved into the room, drawn by something she could not name. "I confess, I could not sleep either. The manor is quite different now than it was before. Quieter, somehow, despite all the additional people." He looked at her with understanding in his dark eyes. "Because before, you were alone with only your thoughts for company. Now, you are alone in a crowded house, which is somehow worse." "Yes," she breathed, surprised by his insight. "Exactly that." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside the windows. Catherine found herself studying him in the flickering firelight, the sharp planes of his face, the weariness etched into every line, the way his hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. "You push yourself too hard," she said quietly. "Dr. Patterson says you refuse treatment for your own injuries, that you work twice as long as you should given your condition." "The men need me," he replied, his voice flat. "My comfort is irrelevant. But if you drive yourself into collapse, you will be of no use to anyone." She leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "Why do you do this to yourself, Major? Why do you insist on bearing everything alone?" For a long moment, she thought he would not answer, would retreat behind the walls of military discipline and masculine stoicism. But then he set down his glass and looked at her with such raw honesty that it stole her breath. "Because I have no right to heal when so many did not survive at all." His voice was rough, scraped raw by emotion he could no longer contain. "Do you know what it is like to ride through a valley of death, To see men cut down on either side of you, to watch your best friend's horse shot out from under him and then see him trampled by the horses behind, to hear him screaming your name, begging for help, while you ride on because to stop would mean your own death and would save no one. His hands were shaking now, gripping the arms of the chair with white-knuckled intensity. I heard him, Your Grace. I heard Michael calling my name and I kept riding. I survived. I rode out of that valley while he died in the mud and blood. And for what? So I could limp around this beautiful house and pretend that my survival means something? So I could write letters to his widow explaining that her husband died bravely in service to his country, leaving out the part where I abandoned him to save myself. Catherine felt tears streaming down her face, the first she had shed in years, and she could not have stopped them if she tried. Here was pain that matched her own, suffering that went soul deep, and suddenly, all her carefully constructed walls seemed meaningless in the face of such raw, honest anguish. She rose from her chair and crossed to him, kneeling beside his chair without thinking about propriety or protocol. She took his shaking hands in hers, felt the calluses and scars, the evidence of a life lived in service and suffering. You did not abandon him, she said fiercely, looking up into his tormented eyes. You made the choice that he would have wanted you to make, to live, to survive, to carry on. You honor his memory by being here, by helping these men, by refusing to let his sacrifice be meaningless. How can you say that? He whispered, his voice breaking. How can you know what he would have wanted? Because I know what I would want. The words came from somewhere deep inside her, from a place she had thought frozen forever. If I loved someone enough to call their name in my last moments, I would want them to live. I would want them to survive and find joy and purpose and meaning. I would want them to heal even if I could not. Something in her words broke through his defenses. His face crumpled, years of suppressed grief and guilt and pain finally overwhelming the rigid control he had maintained. He buried his face in his hands, and great, racking sobs shook his frame. Catherine did not think. She simply acted, rising from her knees to wrap her arms around him, holding him as he fell apart. I can't forget, he gasped between sobs. I can't forget their faces, their voices, the smell of blood and gunpowder and death. It's always there, always waiting in every shadow, every quiet moment. I close my eyes and I see them dying over and over again, and I cannot make it stop. Then do not try to forget, Catherine whispered, her own tears falling into his dark hair. Do not try to be anything other than what you are. A man who survived something unsurvivable, who carries wounds that may never fully heal, who wakes each day and chooses to keep living despite the pain. That is not weakness, Alexander. That is extraordinary courage. She realized too late that she had used his given name, had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. But he did not pull away. Instead, his arms came up to wrap around her waist, holding her as if she were the only solid thing in a world gone mad. They stayed that way for a long time, two broken people clinging to each other in the darkness, finding in each other's pain a strange sort of comfort. The ice that had surrounded Catherine's heart for so long began to crack and splinter, and she found herself feeling things she had sworn never to feel again. Compassion, tenderness, connection. And underneath it all, terrifying in its intensity, the first stirrings of something that felt dangerously like love. When Alexander finally pulled back, his eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his face blotchy from crying. He looked younger somehow, stripped of the military bearing that usually held him rigid. Forgive me, he said hoarsely. I should not have burdened you with my weakness. It is not a burden, Catherine replied, still kneeling before him, her hands resting on his knees. And it is not weakness to acknowledge pain. If anything, it is the first step toward healing. He looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Gratitude and wonder and something deeper, something that made her breath catch. Who are you, Catherine Ashworth? You present yourself to the world as cold and untouchable, and yet you kneel in the ashes of my broken spirit and tell me that I am courageous. You hold me while I fall apart and make me feel less alone than I have felt since I rode out of that valley of death. Catherine felt her walls crumbling, felt the ice melting in the heat of his gaze. I am no one special, she whispered. I am simply a woman who understands what it means to have your heart broken beyond repair, to build walls to keep the world at bay, to go through the motions of living while feeling dead inside. Then we are the same, you and I. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle despite his calluses. Two ghosts haunting a beautiful house, pretending to be alive. Perhaps we could pretend together. She heard herself say, terrified and exhilarated by her own daring. Perhaps we could help each other remember what it feels like to be human again. Catherine. He began, but she pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Do not think. Do not analyze or rationalize or retreat behind duty and propriety. Just answer me this. Do you feel less alone when you are with me? Yes. He breathed against her fingers. God help me, yes. When I am with you, the ghosts are quieter. The darkness is less consuming. I feel like perhaps I could learn to be human again, if you would teach me. Then we shall teach each other, Catherine said, and leaned forward to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two damaged souls testing unfamiliar waters. But then something ignited between them. Not the hot, passionate fire of youthful romance, but something deeper and more profound. It was the recognition of kindred spirits, the meeting of two people who had been alone in their darkness for too long and who suddenly, miraculously, found that they did not have to be alone anymore. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, their foreheads pressed together, hands still clasped. I am afraid, Catherine admitted in a whisper. I am afraid of feeling again, of letting someone past my defenses, of being hurt again. As am I, Alexander replied. But I am more afraid of the alternative, of continuing to exist without truly living, of dying inside while my body goes through the motions of survival. Then we shall be afraid together, Catherine said, and this time when she kissed him, there was no hesitation, no holding back. There was only the two of them, two broken pieces that somehow fit together, creating something whole and new and terrifying in its beauty. That night marked the true beginning of their transformation. Not a sudden, magical cure for all their wounds, but a slow thawing, a gradual return to life. They began to spend their evenings together in the library, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in comfortable silence, sometimes reading aloud from the books that lined the walls. Alexander told her about his life before the war, about growing up as the youngest son of a minor baron, about his decision to join the cavalry against his father's wishes, about the adventures and friendships that had defined his early career. Catherine, in turn, found herself sharing things she had never told anyone, about her first love and betrayal, about her marriages of convenience, about the child she had lost and the grief that had frozen her heart. They helped each other in small ways. Catherine convinced Alexander to see Dr. Patterson about his injuries, to allow himself to be treated like the patient he was rather than only the officer responsible for others. Alexander, in turn, drew Catherine out of her self-imposed isolation, encouraging her to engage more fully with the recovering officers, to see them not as duty or charity but as human beings with stories and dreams of their own. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, Ashworth Manor began to transform from a hospital into something more, a true convalescent home where broken men not only healed their bodies but began to rediscover their humanity. It started with small continue, but please write the conclusion in this section things. Lieutenant Carstairs organizing a card game in the ward, Captain Morrison finally speaking after weeks of silence to ask for a letter to be written to his mother, Ensign Phillips learning to laugh again at some jokes shared among the men. The transformation in the manor mirrored the transformation occurring within Catherine and Alexander themselves. The walls they had built around their hearts, so carefully constructed and so fiercely defended, were slowly dismantling brick by brick. It was not a smooth or easy process. There were setbacks and moments of fear, Nights when old demons returned with a vengeance and days when the weight of the past seemed too heavy to bear. But they faced these challenges together, and that made all the difference. It was on a clear February morning, 6 weeks after Alexander's arrival, that Catherine found him in the conservatory, a glass-enclosed room filled with exotic plants that had been her late husband's pride. He was standing before the windows, looking out over the snow-covered grounds, and there was something in his posture that made her pause in the doorway. "Alexander?" she called softly, and he turned to face her. The change in him was remarkable. He still carried the scars, both visible and invisible, but there was something different in his eyes now. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of hope alongside it. The rigid military bearing had softened into something more natural, more human. He smiled when he saw her, and this time, the smile reached his eyes. "Catherine, I was hoping to find you." He crossed to her, his limp still pronounced but his movements more fluid, less guarded. "I wanted to thank you." "For what?" she asked, though her heart was already racing at his proximity, at the warmth in his gaze. "For saving my life." He took her hands in his thumbs tracing gentle circles on her palms. "Not just by opening your home to us, though that alone would warrant eternal gratitude, but for seeing me, truly seeing me, when I had convinced myself I was invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of the world. For showing me that survival and living are not the same thing, and that I had been merely surviving for far too long." Catherine felt tears pricking her eyes again. Happy tears this time, so different from the bitter ones she had shed in her years of frozen isolation. "You saved me too, you know. I had convinced myself that I was content in my coldness, that I was safer behind my walls than I could ever be in the messy, painful reality of connection. But you showed me that safety without warmth is just another form of death." "Then we saved each other," Alexander said, and drew her close, his arms wrapping around her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. Two broken souls who found each other in the darkness and decided to seek the light together. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms, listening to the silence of falling snow and the distant sounds of life continuing in the wards. Catherine rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Proof that he was alive, that they were both alive, that they had found their way back from the cold, dark places where they had been lost. "I love you," she whispered, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating on her lips. "I did not think I would ever say those words again, did not think I would ever feel them again. But I do. I love you, Alexander Thornton, with all your scars and shadows and unquiet ghosts. I love the man you were, the man you are, and the man you are becoming." Alexander pulled back slightly, just enough to look into her eyes, and what she saw in his face took her breath away. It was joy, pure, uncomplicated joy, mixed with wonder and a love so profound that it seemed to radiate from him like light. "And I love you, Catherine Ashworth," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known. Strong and wounded and brave beyond measure. You took your broken heart and instead of letting it harden into bitterness, you transformed it into compassion for others who suffer. You are not cold despite what you tell yourself. You are fire contained in ice, and I feel privileged beyond words to be the one who gets to witness you thaw." He kissed her then, deep and passionate and full of promise, and Catherine felt the last of the ice around her heart finally, completely melt away. In its place was warmth, the warmth of love, of connection, of two people who had found in each other not a fairy tale salvation, but something far more valuable and real. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, their faces flushed and eyes bright. "Marry me," Alexander said suddenly, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I know it is too soon. I know there are propriety and protocol to consider. I know I am not the match your title and fortune deserve. But I cannot imagine spending another day without you. Cannot imagine facing the future alone when I could face it with you by my side." Catherine laughed, a sound of pure, uncomplicated happiness that she had not heard from her own lips in over a decade. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I will marry you. Not because of propriety or protocol, not for title or fortune, but because I choose you. I choose us. I choose the messy, imperfect, beautiful reality of building a life together." Alexander swept her up in his arms, spinning her around despite his injured leg, both of them laughing like children. And in that moment, surrounded by exotic plants and winter sunshine streaming through glass walls, two broken souls found themselves suddenly, miraculously whole. The wedding took place 3 months later, in the spring of 1848, in the small chapel on the Ashworth estate. It was a simple affair by aristocratic standards, just the recovering officers, the manor staff, and a few close friends. Catherine wore a gown of ivory silk, with wildflowers in her hair that reminded her of the girl she had once been, before the world had taught her to be cold. Alexander stood at the altar in his dress uniform, his scars visible and his eyes clear, waiting for her with a smile that held no shadows as she walked down the aisle toward him. Catherine reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been broken by love once, had sworn never to risk her heart again, had built walls so high that she thought nothing could scale them. But Alexander had not scaled her walls. He had simply sat beside them until she felt safe enough to open the gates herself. And in doing so, he had taught her that love was not the enemy, that vulnerability was not weakness, that the risk of pain was worth taking for the chance at genuine connection. The officers cheered as they exchanged vows, as Alexander slipped a simple gold band onto her finger, and she did the same for him. There was no pretense, no performance, just two people promising to face whatever came next together. The nightmares and the memories, the scars and the healing, the darkness and the light. "I love you, Catherine Thornton," Alexander whispered as they shared their first kiss as husband and wife, and she felt the truth of it in every fiber of her being. "And I love you, my darling Alexander," she replied, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "You have thawed my frozen soul and taught me to live again." As they walked back down the aisle hand in hand, with the spring sunshine streaming through the chapel windows and the cheers of the officers ringing in their ears, Catherine realized that this was not a fairy tale ending. It was something better, a real beginning. They would still have difficult days ahead. Alexander's wounds, both physical and psychological, would take years to fully heal, if they ever healed completely. Catherine's fears about love and betrayal would resurface at unexpected moments, requiring patience and reassurance. They would argue and struggle and sometimes fail to understand each other. But they would face it all together, two imperfect people who had found in each other not perfection, but acceptance. They had learned that healing was not about erasing scars, but about learning to live with them. That love was not about being rescued, but about choosing to save yourself while someone stands beside you, offering their hand. And in the years that followed, Ashworth Manor would remain a convalescent hospital, a place where broken soldiers could come to heal not just their bodies, but their spirits. Catherine and Alexander would dedicate themselves to this work, creating a sanctuary where men could face their demons with courage and support. They would have children, 3 in total, who would grow up understanding that strength came in many forms, that vulnerability was not weakness, and that the greatest courage was in choosing to keep living and loving even after the world had shown you its cruelest face on quiet evenings. When the children were asleep and the manor was still, Catherine and Alexander would sit together in the library where they had first truly seen each other, where they had first allowed their walls to crumble. They would hold hands and share comfortable silence, two souls who had found their way out of the darkness together, and Catherine would remember the frozen Duchess she had once been. Cold, isolated, convinced that her heart was too damaged to ever love again. She would remember the bitter, broken woman who had offered her home to wounded soldiers not out of compassion, but out of a desperate need to fill the emptiness inside her. And she would marvel at how wrong she had been, how much she had underestimated the human capacity for transformation. Because in the end, she had not saved Alexander, and he had not saved her. They had simply stood together in their brokenness until they were strong enough to start putting the pieces back together. They had chosen each other, chosen love, chosen life, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the greatest courage is not in staying frozen to protect yourself from pain, but in allowing yourself to thaw, to feel, to risk everything for the possibility of genuine connection. The frozen Duchess had thawed, and in her place stood a woman who was fully, vibrantly alive. Not because a man had rescued her, but because she had finally found the courage to rescue herself, with a partner who understood that true love was not about being each other's salvation, but about being each other's witness, companion, and choice, and that Catherine would think on those quiet evenings with her hand in Alexander's and the fire crackling before them, was the greatest love story of all. Not the fairy tale she had once believed in, but the messy, beautiful, real love that came from two people choosing each other every single day, scars and all. This was their happily ever after. Not perfect, not without pain, but real and earned and worth every moment of fear it had taken to reach it. The frozen Duchess had thawed, the broken soldier had healed, and together they had built a life that honored their past while embracing their future. And in the spring sunshine of Ashworth Manor, surrounded by men who were learning to live again and children who knew only love, Catherine and Alexander Thornton found their peace. Not in forgetting their wounds, but in choosing to live fully despite them. The ice had melted, the soul had thawed, and love, real and imperfect and beautiful, had won. But peace, Catherine would learn, was not a destination but a daily practice, and some ghosts refused to stay buried. It was a warm afternoon in June, nearly a year after their wedding, when the past came calling in the form of a cream-colored envelope bearing a London postmark. Catherine was in the garden with their 3-month-old daughter, Eleanor, named after Alexander's mother, when Mrs. Talbot brought out the afternoon post on a silver tray. "A letter for you, Your Grace," the housekeeper said, her expression curious. "From someone named Edward Whitmore." Catherine's blood turned to ice in her veins. The name she had not heard spoken in years. The name that still had the power to make her heart clench with remembered pain. Edward. The man who had left her at the altar, who had destroyed her faith in love and goodness, who had been the first crack in the foundation of her soul. She stared at the envelope as if it were a serpent coiled to strike. "Your Grace, shall I take it away?" Mrs. Talbot asked, noting Catherine's frozen expression. "No," Catherine managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Leave it." "Thank you, Mrs. Talbot." The housekeeper departed, casting one last concerned glance over her shoulder. Catherine sat holding her daughter with one arm, staring at the envelope with the other hand hovering over it as if afraid to touch it. Eleanor gurgled happily, oblivious to her mother's turmoil, reaching for the dancing shadows of leaves overhead. After several long moments, Catherine carefully set Eleanor in her bassinet and opened the letter with trembling fingers. "My dear Catherine, I hope this letter finds you well and that you will forgive the presumption of my writing after so many years of silence. I have recently learned of your marriage to Major Thornton and wish to extend my congratulations on finding happiness. I am writing to inform you that I will be in the district next week on business matters related to my wife's family estate. I wonder if it might be possible for us to meet, just briefly, so that I might offer my apologies in person for the pain I caused you so many years ago. I have carried the weight of that terrible decision for nearly a decade, and though I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, I would like the opportunity to at least express my profound regret. If you prefer not to see me, I will understand completely and will trouble you no further. But if you can find it in your heart to grant me just a few minutes of your time, I would be eternally grateful. Your humble servant, Edward Whitmore." Catherine read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking more with each reading. 1,000 emotions warred within her. Anger at his presumption, curiosity about what he could possibly say after all these years, fear that seeing him would resurrect all the old pain, and beneath it all, a small, treacherous part of her that wanted to face him, to show him what she had become, to prove that she had not only survived his betrayal but had thrived despite it. She was so absorbed in her tumultuous thoughts that she did not hear Alexander's approach until his hand rested gently on her shoulder. "Catherine, what is it? You look as though you've seen a ghost." She looked up at him, this man who had become her anchor and her salvation, and saw the concern in his dark eyes, the love that had never wavered even in their most difficult moments. And suddenly, she knew what she had to do. "I have seen a ghost in a manner of speaking," she said, handing him the letter. "From my past, from before I became the frozen Duchess." Alexander read the letter in silence, his jaw tightening with each line. When he finished, he looked at her with an expression that mingled protectiveness with understanding. "Edward Whitmore, the man who left you at the altar." It was not a question. Catherine had told him everything during their long nights of sharing histories, had held nothing back from him. "Yes. He wants to see me to apologize." Catherine stood, pacing across the garden path. "I do not know what to do, Alexander. Part of me wants to refuse, to ignore him as he once ignored me. But another part—" She paused, struggling to articulate the complex tangle of emotions. "Another part wants to face him, to see what he has to say, to close that chapter of my life properly rather than leaving it to fester in the shadows." Alexander was quiet for a long moment, watching her pace, his analytical military mind clearly working through the situation. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle but firm. "What do you want to do, Catherine? Not what you think you should do, not what propriety demands, but what your heart tells you is right." Catherine stopped pacing and looked at him. This man who had taught her that vulnerability was strength, that facing one's demons was braver than hiding from them. "I want to see him," she admitted. "I want to look him in the eye and hear what he has to say. I want to prove to myself, and perhaps to him, that he no longer has any power over me, that I have moved beyond the girl he destroyed and become someone stronger, someone whole." "Then see him," Alexander said simply. "But not alone. I will be there, not to speak or interfere, but simply to remind you that you are not that abandoned girl anymore. You are Catherine Thornton, Duchess of Ashworth, wife and mother, healer of broken soldiers. You are a woman who has survived her own valley of death and emerged stronger for it." Catherine crossed to him, throwing her arms around his neck and holding him tight. "How did I ever exist without you?" she whispered. "The same way I existed without you," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "In darkness, going through the motions of living without truly being alive. But we found each other, and that makes all the difference." 3 days later, on a cloudless afternoon that seemed too beautiful for such a fraught encounter, Edward Whitmore arrived at Ashworth Manor. Catherine watched from the drawing-room window as his carriage rolled up the drive. Her heart was pounding, her palms damp with perspiration despite her outward composure. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that brought out her eyes, her hair arranged in an elegant style that spoke of wealth and position. She looked every inch the Duchess she had become, and that armor of appearance gave her courage. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back. A steady, grounding presence that reminded her she was not alone in this. When Edward was shown into the drawing room, Catherine's first thought was how much he had changed, and how much he had remained the same. He was still handsome, with golden hair and blue eyes that had once made her heart flutter. But there were lines around his eyes now, a weariness in his expression that spoke of experiences that had tempered his youthful charm. He was well-dressed in a manner that suggested comfortable prosperity, but not the opulent wealth of the aristocracy. He stopped short when he saw her, and for a moment, something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or recognition of what he had lost. "Catherine," he said softly, "thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I have no right to your time or attention after what I did." "No, you do not," Catherine replied, her voice cool and controlled. "But my husband convinced me that perhaps facing you was necessary for my own peace of mind. Edward Whitmore, may I introduce Major Alexander Thornton, my husband." The two men regarded each other with the wariness of potential adversaries. Edward inclined his head respectfully, while Alexander merely nodded, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. "Major Thornton," I have heard of your valor at Balaclava. You are a hero, sir. I am a survivor, nothing more, Alexander replied flatly. And I am here as Catherine's husband and support, not as a participant in this conversation. Please, say what you came to say. Edward swallowed hard and turned back to Catherine. May we sit? Catherine gestured to the chairs arranged before the fireplace, and they all took their seats. Catherine and Alexander on the settee, Edward in a chair facing them. The arrangement put Edward slightly below them, slightly off balance, and Catherine wondered if Alexander had deliberately positioned the furniture this way. I hardly know where to begin, Edward said, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. How does one apologize for destroying another person's life? How can mere words possibly convey the depth of my regret? They cannot, Catherine said simply. But you may try nonetheless. Edward took a deep breath, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with emotion that seemed genuine. I was a coward, Catherine. A weak, selfish coward who allowed himself to be manipulated and threatened by people who cared nothing for happiness or love, only for money and social position. My father had gambling debts, massive debts that threatened to destroy our family. The woman I married, Arabella Hutchinson, came with a dowry large enough to save us from ruin. Her father made it clear that the offer would be rescinded if I married anyone else. He paused, his eyes pleading for understanding even as his words condemned him. I told myself I was doing the noble thing, sacrificing my own happiness for the sake of my family. But the truth is that I was simply too afraid to stand up to my father, too weak to choose love over financial security. I convinced myself that you would be better off without me, that you would find someone else, that time would heal the wound I inflicted. You convinced yourself of lies, Catherine said, her voice sharp as broken glass. I did not simply move on, Edward. You destroyed me. You shattered my faith in love, in goodness, in the fundamental decency of people. My father died from the shock and scandal. My mother followed him within the year. My sister's prospects were ruined by association with me. I became a joke, a cautionary tale. The girl who was so flawed that her intended could not bear to marry her even when he had made promises before God and man. Tears were streaming down Edward's face now, and Catherine felt a savage satisfaction in his obvious pain. I know, he whispered. I know, and I have lived with that knowledge for nearly a decade. My marriage to Arabella has been a prison of mutual resentment and unhappiness. She knows I did not love her, and she has punished me for it every day of our married life. We have no children. She refuses to allow me in her bed except when necessary to maintain appearances. I am trapped in a life I despise, married to a woman who despises me in turn, carrying the guilt of what I did to you like a millstone around my neck. Good, Catherine said coldly, and felt Alexander's hand tighten warningly on hers. She took a breath, moderating her tone slightly. You deserve every moment of unhappiness you have experienced. You made your choice, Edward. You chose money over love, cowardice over courage, and now you must live with the consequences. I know, Edward said again, and I am not here seeking your forgiveness or your pity. I am here because I needed to look you in the eye and tell you that you were right to hate me, that everything that happened was my fault, not yours. You were not flawed, Catherine. You were perfect, and I was too blind and weak to see it. He gestured toward Alexander. But it seems you found someone who does see it, someone who deserves you in a way I never could have. When I heard you had married a war hero, had opened your home to wounded soldiers, had found happiness and purpose, I felt relief beneath the regret. Relief that you had survived what I did to you, that you had built a life worth living. Catherine felt her anger cooling, not disappearing but transforming into something else. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a release of the poisonous grip that hatred had maintained on her heart for so long. I did survive, she said quietly, but not because of some inherent strength or virtue. I survived because I turned my heart to ice, because I convinced myself that love was a trap and connection was weakness. I built walls so high that I nearly suffocated behind them. It was only through meeting Alexander, through being forced to care for men whose suffering dwarfed my own petty grievances, that I learned to thaw, to live again, to risk my heart despite knowing it could be broken. She looked at Alexander, drawing strength from his steady presence. So yes, I have found happiness. But it was not a gift given to me. It was something I had to fight for, claw my way toward, earn through confronting my own demons and choosing to be vulnerable despite my fears. You set me on that path, Edward, but you do not get credit for where I ended up. That is mine alone, mine and Alexander's. Edward nodded slowly, seeming to understand the distinction she was making. Then I am glad you found your way, even if the path was painful, and I hope that in time, you can find it in your heart to let go of the hatred you have carried for me. Not for my sake, but for yours. Hatred is a heavy burden, and you deserve to be free of it. Catherine considered his words carefully. She realized that she had been carrying Edward's betrayal like a shield, using it to justify her coldness, to excuse her refusal to engage with life. But she did not need that shield anymore. She had Alexander. She had Eleanor. She had a life filled with purpose and meaning. I do not hate you anymore, Edward, she said finally, and was surprised to find that it was true. I pity you. You made a choice that cost you everything that matters: love, honor, self-respect. You live in a prison of your own making, and no apology can set you free from that. But I forgive you, not because you deserve it, but because I refuse to let you hold any more space in my heart. That space belongs to my family now, to the life I have built from the ruins of what you destroyed. Edward's face crumpled with relief and grief mingled together. Thank you, he whispered. I know I have no right to your forgiveness, but I thank you nonetheless. He stood, and Alexander rose with him, his height and bearing making Edward seem small and diminished by comparison. I will not trouble you again, Edward said. I wish you every happiness, Catherine. You deserve all the joy this world can offer. He bowed and turned to leave, but Catherine's voice stopped him at the door. Edward, one last thing. He turned back, hope flickering in his eyes. Do better, Catherine said firmly. You cannot change the past, but you can choose differently in the future. If you are truly sorry, then be a better man. Be the husband Arabella deserves, even if she makes it difficult. Be the son your father needs. Be someone who looks in the mirror and does not flinch at what he sees. That is the only penance that matters. Edward stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I will try, he said. I cannot promise to succeed, but I will try. And then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, taking with him the last vestiges of the girl Catherine had once been, the naive, trusting girl who had believed in fairy tales. Catherine sat down heavily, feeling suddenly exhausted. Alexander immediately sat beside her, pulling her into his arms. How do you feel? He asked gently. Catherine thought about it, taking inventory of her emotions. Free, she said finally. I feel free. He was right about one thing: hatred is a heavy burden. And I find I no longer wish to carry it. You were magnificent, Alexander said, pride evident in his voice. Strong and honest and merciful, even when you had every right to be cruel. You are an extraordinary woman, Catherine Thornton. I am just a woman, Catherine replied, resting her head on his shoulder. A woman who has made mistakes and been wounded and had to learn, painfully and slowly, how to be human again. But I am learning, with you by my side. They sat in silence for a moment, and then Alexander spoke, his voice thoughtful. You know, when I first arrived at Ashworth Manor, I saw you as an ice queen, beautiful and untouchable and cold. But I was wrong. You were never cold. You were frozen, trapped in ice not of your making, waiting for the right warmth to thaw you. And in thawing you, I found that I was thawing as well. We saved each other, Catherine. not through grand gestures or dramatic rescues, but through small moments of honesty and vulnerability, through choosing each other every day despite our fears. Catherine lifted her head to look at him, this man who had taught her to live again, and felt her heart overflow with love so profound it brought tears to her eyes. "I love you, Alexander Thornton," she said. "I love you for seeing me when I was invisible, for standing beside me when I faced my past, for teaching me that being broken does not mean being beyond repair." "And I love you, Catherine Thornton," he replied, cupping her face in his hands. "I love you for your strength and your scars, for your courage in facing your demons, for showing me that survival and living are not the same thing, and that choosing to live, truly live, requires more bravery than any charge into battle." They kissed then, soft and sweet and full of promise, two souls who had found each other in the darkness and chosen to walk toward the light together. Outside, Eleanor began to cry from her bassinet in the garden, and they broke apart with a laugh, the heavy emotions of the encounter with Edward dissipating in the face of their daughter's immediate needs as they walked together into the garden. Catherine reflected on the unexpected gift that Edward's visit had given her. Not closure, exactly, but perspective. She had thought that seeing him would reopen old wounds, would remind her of all she had lost. Instead, it had shown her how much she had gained. The girl who had loved Edward Whitmore had been naive and innocent, believing that love was simple and that happy endings were guaranteed to those who were good and true. The woman who loved Alexander Thornton knew better. She knew that love was complicated and messy, that happy endings had to be fought for and earned, that being vulnerable meant risking pain, but that the alternative, a life lived behind walls, safe but empty, was no life at all. She picked up Eleanor, who immediately stopped crying and cooed happily at her mother's face. Alexander stood beside them, his arm around Catherine's waist, and together they looked out over the grounds of Ashworth Manor, the place that had once been her prison and was now her sanctuary, the place where broken soldiers came to heal and where she had healed alongside them. "Thank you," she whispered to Alexander. "For what?" "For standing beside me today, for not trying to fight my battles for me but simply offering your strength when I needed it, for trusting me to face my past while knowing you would catch me if I fell. Always," Alexander promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "In darkness and in light, in joy and in sorrow, in facing ghosts and building futures. Always, I will stand beside you." A knock at the door interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called softly, not wanting to wake Alexander. Mrs. Talbot, now in her 70s but still sharp as ever, entered with the Morning Post. The housekeeper had become family over the decades, a witness to Catherine's transformation from ice queen to the warm, vibrant woman she had become. "Morning, Your Grace," Mrs. Talbot said, using the title that Catherine had long ago asked her to drop in private but which the housekeeper stubbornly maintained. "There's a letter here that I thought you'd want to see immediately. It's from America." Catherine's heart quickened. She knew only one person who would write from America, Edward Whitmore. After their encounter 25 years earlier, she had thought never to hear from him again. But 5 years ago, a letter had arrived informing her that his wife Arabella had died, and that he had sold his English properties and emigrated to America to start fresh. Since then, they had maintained a sporadic correspondence, not friends exactly, but perhaps something like witnesses to each other's attempts at redemption. She opened the letter, noting immediately that the handwriting was shakier than usual, the words less carefully formed. "My dear Catherine, I write to you from my sickbed, knowing that this will likely be my last letter to you or anyone. The doctor has informed me that my heart is failing, and I have perhaps weeks left. If I am fortunate, I find myself reflecting on my life as one does when facing death, taking inventory of my choices and their consequences. And I find myself wanting to tell you, one final time, what your forgiveness meant to me all those years ago. After leaving Ashworth Manor that day, I carried your words with me like a talisman. Do better. And I tried, Catherine. God knows I tried. I could not save my marriage to Arabella. The damage was too deep, the resentment too firmly rooted. But I tried to be kinder, more honest, more present. I tried to be the man you deserved all those years ago, even if it was too late for us. Asterisk when Arabella died and I came to America, I found a kind of freedom I had never